When the train doors opened and the whole platform went quiet, judging her before she'd taken a single step, nobody in Frost Crossing expected the sheriff to be the only man who didn't look away. They thought she was too big, too soft, too foreign to survive a winter that had already buried 3 grown men. They were wrong. Stay with me to the end, hit like, and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The wind came down off the ridge before the snow ever did, and that was how the men of Frost Crossing always knew winter was serious about arriving. It rattled the tin roof of the jailhouse, snapped at the loose board on the boardwalk outside the mercantile, and worked its way under doors that had been hung crooked since the town was built. Sheriff Gareth Holloway stood on his porch with a cup of coffee, gone cold in his hand, and watched the gray sky press down over the mountains like a lid closing on a pot. He was 34 years old, though most folks would have guessed older. There was a stillness in him that didn't belong to a young man, a quiet that had settled into his shoulders the way frost settles into a fence post, permanent and unbothered by the seasons. He'd been sheriff of this town for 6 years. Before that, he'd been a husband for 2, and a father for almost none, and neither of those things had lasted, and neither of those things was something he talked about. People in Frost Crossing knew the shape of his grief, even if they didn't know its details. They knew not to ask, and he was grateful for that, in the way a man is grateful for the absence of pain rather than the presence of comfort. He drank the last of the coffee, made a face at the cold bitterness of it, and went back inside to where the fire was struggling against a draft he hadn't gotten around to fixing. The house had been his father's, and his father's before that, a long, low structure of timber and stone that had been built for a family and had housed, for the last several years, exactly 1 man and a dog that had died the previous spring and never been replaced. The rooms upstairs hadn't seen a fire lit in them since before that. Dust gathered on the windowsills in soft gray drifts. The kitchen held a single chair pulled up to the table because there had never been a reason for 2. Gareth set the cup down hard enough to make a sound and looked around the room like a man taking inventory of a failure. "This won't do," he said, to no one, because there was no one to say it to. Not for another winter. He told himself the same thing the year before, and the year before that, and each time the words had evaporated the moment the first frost passed, and the work of simply surviving took over and left no room for fixing what could be merely endured. But this year there was a difference, small and hard to name, a kind of exhaustion that had crept past his bones and into something deeper. He was tired of coming home to a cold house. He was tired of eating beans out of a pot standing at the stove because there was no reason to sit at a table built for more than 1 person. He was tired, plainly and simply, of being the only sound in his own home. So that afternoon, with the wind picking up outside and the first hard pellets of sleet ticking against the window glass, he sat down at his desk in the jailhouse, the one place in town that always had a decent fire, courtesy of his deputy Ezra Webb, who hated the cold more than he hated outlaws. And he wrote out an advertisement for a housekeeper. He wrote it 3 times before he was satisfied, crossing out lines that sounded too desperate and lines that sounded too cold, settling finally on something plain and honest: wanted. Housekeeper for sheriff's residence, Frost Crossing, cooking, mending, general household duties, room and board provided. Fair wage, reply by letter to Sheriff G. Holloway. He read it over once, folded it, and walked it down to the telegraph office himself, where old Mr. Pruitt squinted at it through his spectacles and said, "You sure about this, Sheriff? Last fella who put an ad like this in the territorial paper got himself 3 replies from women who turned out to be running from husbands, and 1 fella pretending to be a woman, looking to rob him blind." "I'll take my chances," Gareth said. "Frost Crossing ain't an easy place to sell to strangers," Pruitt said, not unkindly. "Winters out here have killed men twice your size." "I know what the winters do," Gareth said, and something in his voice closed the conversation the way a door closes a room, and Pruitt didn't ask anything further. The advertisement ran in 3 territorial papers over the following weeks, and Gareth, true to his own prediction, did not expect much to come of it. He went about his work, settling a dispute between 2 ranchers over a fence line, breaking up a fight outside the saloon that left 1 man with a split lip and considerable embarrassment, riding the long loop around the county that took him 2 days each way and left him saddle sore and silent. And he did not think much more about the advertisement, except in the evenings, when he came home to the same cold house and the same single chair and felt the absence of an answer like a small, persistent ache. Then, on a gray Tuesday, 3 weeks later, a letter arrived. It came by way of the territorial mail coach, a single envelope with foreign handwriting on it, looping and careful, the kind of penmanship that spoke of someone who had been taught to write as a discipline rather than a habit. Gareth turned it over twice before opening it, the way a man examines an object he doesn't quite trust, and then he broke the seal and read, "Dear Sheriff Holloway, my name is Aniela Kovac. I read your advertisement in the territorial paper, and I write to offer myself for the position of housekeeper. I came to this country 8 months ago from across the sea, and I have worked since then in a boarding house in the city, cleaning and cooking and managing accounts. But the work has ended, and I am in need of new employment. I am a hard worker. I do not complain. I can cook plain food well, and I am learning your American dishes. I can sew and mend and keep accounts, and I am not afraid of difficult winters, as where I come from the winters are also hard. I have no family in this country, and no obligations that would interfere with the position. If you are willing to consider me, I would be grateful for the opportunity to prove myself capable. I understand if you prefer otherwise. Sincerely, Aniela Kovac." Gareth read the letter twice. There was something about it that struck him. Not the content exactly, which was plain and businesslike in the way he'd hoped for, but the carefulness of it, the way each sentence seemed weighed before it was set down, as if the woman writing it had learned somewhere along the way that words could be taken from her and used against her if she wasn't careful with them. "I understand if you prefer otherwise." That last line sat with him longer than it should have. It was the sentence of someone who expected to be turned away. He sat at his kitchen table, the one good chair, the bare wood scarred with years of use, and thought about it for a long while. Then he took out paper and pen and wrote back, plain as her own letter had been. "Miss Kovac, position is yours if you want it. Fair wage, room and board as advertised. Train comes through Frost Crossing on Thursdays. Send word when you mean to arrive, and I will meet you at the station. G. Holloway." He sent it without much ceremony, the way he did most things, and went back to the business of being sheriff, and did not think of it again until 2 weeks later a second letter arrived confirming that she would be on the Thursday train and asking, with the same careful politeness as before, whether there was anything in particular she ought to bring or anything she ought to know about the house before she came. He wrote back that there was nothing in particular she needed to bring, only herself, and that the house had a good well and a good stove and not much else worth knowing, and that he would meet her train. The day she arrived, the sky over Frost Crossing was the color of an old bruise, heavy and yellow-gray at the edges, the kind of sky that promised the first real snow of the season. Gareth stood on the platform with his hat pulled low and his coat buttoned to the throat, watching the train come around the bend with its plume of smoke trailing behind it like a gray scarf, and he found himself, against his own habits, somewhat nervous. He didn't examine the feeling closely. He never did. The train hissed to a stop. Doors opened. A handful of passengers stepped down. A drummer with a case of samples, 2 cowhands returning from a cattle drive, an older woman being helped down by her son, and then, last of all, a woman stepped onto the platform carrying a single worn suitcase, and the whole platform, without seeming to mean to, went quiet. She was a big woman, not tall, middling height, if anything, but broad through the shoulders and hips, soft-bodied in a way the frontier rarely was, wrapped in a coat that had clearly been mended more than once, with a wool scarf pulled up over dark hair that had begun to come loose from its pins during the long journey. Her face was round and open, her eyes a pale gray-green, and there was a tiredness in them that spoke of a long way traveled, not just by train, but by ocean and by years. She stood on the platform for a moment, looking around with the careful, searching expression of someone in a place they don't yet trust, and the silence around her stretched out long enough to become its own kind of cruelty. Gareth heard it before he saw who'd said it, a low mutter from one of the cowhands, not quite quiet enough. "Lord, Sheriff's housekeeper, is that her? She'll eat him out of house and home before the snow even sets in." A short laugh from the other cowhand, quickly stifled. Gareth's jaw tightened, but he didn't look at them. He'd learned a long time ago that giving a man's cruelty your attention only fed it. Instead, he walked straight across the platform toward the woman with the suitcase, and he took his hat off, which he didn't do for most people, and he said, "Miss Kovac." She looked at him with something like surprise, as though she hadn't quite expected him to come, or hadn't quite expected him to be courteous when he did. "Sheriff Holloway," she said. Her accent was thick, the vowels rounded in a way that marked her as a stranger to anyone who heard her speak, and there was a slight unsteadiness in her voice, the kind that comes from being stared at by an entire platform of strangers. "Thank you for meeting me." "Long trip," he said, nodding at the suitcase. "That all you've got?" "Yes," she said, and something flickered across her face. Not embarrassment exactly, but a kind of brace, as if she expected the question to be the opening line of a longer judgment. "I did not bring much. I did not know how much room there would be." "Plenty of room," Gareth said, and reached for the suitcase before she could protest. And she let him take it with a small, surprised exhale, as though she hadn't expected that either. Behind them, the cowhands had drifted off toward the saloon, but their laughter carried back on the wind, and a few other townsfolk who had wandered out to see the train come in stood in small clusters along the platform's edge, watching the new arrival with open, unhurried curiosity, the kind that didn't bother to disguise itself. Mrs. Tilden, who ran the boarding house, leaned over to whisper something to her neighbor behind a gloved hand. A young man Gareth didn't recognize, new to town, working at the livery, he thought, looked Aniela up and down with an expression that made Gareth's hand tighten briefly on the suitcase handle. Aniela noticed. Of course she noticed. A woman who had crossed an ocean alone, who had spent a lifetime being measured by the width of her hips and the roundness of her face before anyone bothered to ask her a single question about her character, did not fail to notice a town's collective verdict passed in the space of 30 seconds. Gareth watched something close behind her eyes, a kind of shudder coming down, practiced and quick. The look of a person bracing for a blow they've taken many times before. "This way," he said gruffly, and started walking, and after a moment she followed. They walked the length of the main street in near silence, Gareth a half step ahead, carrying the suitcase, Aniela beside him with her coat drawn tight against the wind that had begun, in earnest now, to carry the first thin flakes of snow. Frost Crossing wasn't much of a town to look at. A single main street with the jailhouse and the mercantile and the saloon and the church and a scattering of houses beyond, all of it hunched low against the mountains, as if bracing for what the season would bring. Aniela took it in with quiet, careful eyes, the way a person studies a place they intend to survive in rather than merely visit. "It is smaller than I thought," she said finally, not as a complaint, just an observation. "Smaller than most things you've seen, I'd guess," Gareth said. "Smaller than the city, yes, but the city was not so—" She paused, searching for the word. "Open. There is so much sky here. Too much, some say, nothing to break the wind." "I do not mind wind," she said, and there was something almost defiant in the way she said it, quiet but firm, as if she'd had to insist on her own toughness too many times before, and the insisting had become reflexive. Gareth glanced sideways at her, just once, and said nothing, but he filed the words away. They reached the house as the snow began to thicken, and Gareth pushed the door open and stood back to let her in first, an old habit of courtesy he hadn't extended to anyone in years. Aniela stepped inside and stood for a moment in the dim front room, looking around at the bare walls, the cold hearth, the single chair at the kitchen table, and something passed across her face that Gareth couldn't quite name. Not pity, not judgment, something quieter and more practical. The look of a person already beginning, in her mind, to make a list of what needed doing. "You live here alone," she said. It wasn't a question. "I do." "For how long?" 6 years. House was my father's before that." She nodded slowly, taking in the room again, and Gareth found himself, for reasons he didn't examine, wanting to explain the bareness of it, the dust on the sills, the single chair, the cold ash in the hearth, wanting to say that it hadn't always looked like this, that there had been a time when the rooms upstairs held warmth and noise, but he didn't say any of it, because he never said any of it to anyone. "I will start tomorrow," Aniela said. "Tonight, if you will show me the kitchen, I will make something to eat. You have been kind enough already today. Let me begin to be useful." Gareth almost smiled. Almost. "Kitchen's through there," he said, nodding toward the doorway. "Stove's a bit stubborn, has to be coaxed." "Most good things do," Aniela said, and there was the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth, gone almost as soon as it appeared, and she set her suitcase down by the door and went to see what she could do with a stubborn stove and a kitchen that hadn't seen a proper meal cooked in it for longer than either of them said aloud. That first night set the pattern for many that followed, though neither of them knew it yet. Aniela found the kitchen in worse order than the rest of the house. A half-empty sack of flour gone stale, a tin of coffee, salt pork, and not much else. And she made do with what there was, producing a simple stew of salt pork and the last of a sack of potatoes Gareth had forgotten he owned, seasoned with whatever dried herbs she found in a tin on the shelf that had clearly not been touched in years. It wasn't fancy. She apologized for that twice before he'd even sat down, in the careful, preemptive way of someone who had learned to apologize for things before they could be criticized. "It's fine food," Gareth said after the first few bites, and meant it. He hadn't had a hot meal cooked by another person's hands in longer than he wanted to count. "It is plain," Aniela said. "Tomorrow I will go to the mercantile, if that is permitted, and see what else there is. I can make better with more to work with." "Permitted," Gareth repeated, almost amused by the word. "It's your kitchen to run, Miss Kovac. I won't be standing over your shoulder." She looked up at him then, something careful and searching in her expression, as if testing whether he meant it. Some employers say such things and do not mean them. "I'm not in the habit of saying things I don't mean," Gareth said. "Waste of breath." She held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded, accepting it, and went back to her food, and they ate the rest of the meal in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable yet, but wasn't hostile either. The silence of two strangers feeling out the shape of an arrangement neither of them fully understood. Outside, the snow kept falling, thickening into the first real storm of the season, and the wind found the gap under the door and the loose board in the kitchen wall and made its complaints known throughout the house. But inside, for the first time in longer than Gareth could easily remember, there was the smell of a cooked meal and the sound of another person's presence, and something in the house, some old, cold quality it had carried for years, seemed just slightly to loosen. The days that followed brought the full weight of the territory's judgment down on Aniela's shoulders, though she carried it, Gareth noticed, with a kind of practiced steadiness that suggested she'd had a great deal of practice. She walked to the mercantile the next morning on her own, despite the cold, despite the curious stares that followed her down the main street, and she came back with a sack of flour and a tin of baking soda and a length of good wool thread, and she did not say a word about whatever had happened inside, though Gareth, watching her come up the path, noticed the particular stiffness in her shoulders, the particular firmness of her jaw, that told him something had been said that she'd chosen not to repeat. He found out anyway 2 days later from Ezra, who had a habit of repeating gossip without quite meaning to, the way some men can't help whistling a tune they've heard once too often. "Mrs. Hartley over at the mercantile's been talking," Ezra said, leaning against the jailhouse doorframe with his hat pushed back. "Says your new housekeeper come in looking like she'd eat the whole shelf of flour herself. Made some comment about how a woman her size oughtn't to be doing hard work in a place like this, oughtn't to last the winter." Gareth's pen stopped moving across the page he'd been writing on. "She say that to her face?" "Way I heard it. Near enough." "And what'd Miss Kovac say back?" Ezra shrugged. "Nothing, from what I hear. Just paid for her goods and left. Didn't even argue." Gareth set the pen down slowly and looked out the jailhouse window at the gray afternoon, the snow still coming down in fits and starts, the street nearly empty of foot traffic. He thought about the careful, preemptive apologies Aniela had offered over a simple pot of stew, the bracing look that had come over her face on the train platform the moment the laughter started, the line in her first letter, "I understand if you prefer otherwise," and something in his chest tightened in a way he didn't have a ready name for. "Folks in this town," he said slowly, "ought to mind their own kitchens before they go commenting on someone else's." Ezra glanced at him sideways, a little surprised by the heat in it. "Didn't figure you for one to get worked up over town gossip, Sheriff." "I'm not worked up," Gareth said, though his voice said otherwise. "I'm saying what's true." He didn't say anything more on the subject, not to Ezra, and not, that evening, to Aniela herself, because he didn't yet have the words for it and wasn't sure it was his place regardless. But he noticed, over the following days, that he found himself walking a little straighter past the mercantile, a little more deliberately, as if daring anyone in earshot to repeat what had been said. He noticed that when old Mrs. Hartley greeted him with her usual fawning courtesy, The next time he came in for supplies, he answered her shorter than he meant to and didn't soften it. It wasn't much. It wasn't a declaration of anything. But it was the first small thread in what would become, over that long winter, a quiet and growing loyalty neither of them could yet name. Aniela, for her part, did not slow down, did not retreat, did not give the town the satisfaction of seeing her falter. If anything, she worked harder, as though determined to answer every whispered judgment with the plain, undeniable evidence of her labor. Within the first week, the house had begun to transform in ways that went beyond the kitchen. She found the loose board in the kitchen wall and asked Gareth, with characteristic directness, whether there was a hammer and nails to be had. And when he produced them, slightly bemused, she fixed the board herself rather than waiting for him to find time. She took the dust-covered curtains down from the front windows, washed them in the wash-house out back despite the bitter cold, and hung them again. And the front room, for the first time in years, didn't look quite so much like a place men passed through rather than lived in. She found, in a trunk upstairs that Gareth had not opened in longer than he wanted to admit, a stack of old quilts gone musty with disuse, and she aired them out and mended the worn seams and laid them across the beds upstairs, room by room, until the cold, empty house had something resembling warmth in every corner of it. "You didn't have to do all this," Gareth said one evening, standing in the doorway of what had once been a spare room and was now, with a fresh quilt and the dust swept from the windowsill, something almost inviting. "It is my work," Aniela said simply, not looking up from the seam she was mending by the lamplight. "A house should be lived in properly, or what is the point of having one? Some men would say a housekeeper's job is to keep house, not to fix walls and air out trunks nobody asked her to open." Aniela looked up at him then, and there was something steady and unapologetic in her gaze. "Some men say many things about what a woman ought and ought not do," she said. "I have heard most of them. I have stopped listening to most of them also." Gareth held her gaze a moment, something working behind his own quiet expression, and then he nodded, once, and said, "Good," and left it at that, and went back downstairs, and Aniela, alone in the lamplight, allowed herself the smallest of smiles before returning to her mending. Chad. The snow deepened through the following weeks into the kind of relentless, grinding winter that Frost Crossing had not seen in several years. The kind that buried fence lines and froze water troughs solid and made every errand into a small battle against the wind. Gareth was called away more often than he liked, settling disputes between snowbound ranchers, riding out twice to help dig stranded travelers from drifts along the territorial road, once staying away 3 full days to deal with a cattle-rustling case that had erupted despite the weather on the county's eastern edge. Each time he left, he found himself, against every old habit of solitary self-reliance, thinking of the house he was riding back toward, not as an empty building to be endured, but as a place where someone was, where a fire would be burning and a meal would be waiting, and a person whose name he was only beginning to understand the shape of would ask him, plainly and without fuss, how the roads had been. He didn't examine that feeling closely either. He wasn't yet ready to. Aniela, in his absences, did not sit idle. She kept the fires burning, kept the house in order, and began, in small ways that Gareth noticed only gradually, to extend her care beyond the walls of the sheriff's house and into the town itself. When the Hendricks family, 3 houses down, ran short on flour after a bout of illness, left the father unable to work, Aniela appeared at their door with a sack of her own provisions and no explanation beyond a simple, "I had extra." When the widow Calloway's roof began leaking under the weight of accumulated snow, Aniela walked the half-mile through drifts to bring soup and sat with the old woman an hour, listening to her talk about a husband 3 years dead, asking questions, nodding, present in a way that cost her nothing but time, and earned her, slowly, the old woman's fierce and unexpected loyalty. The children of the town, who had no patience for adult judgments about size or foreignness, took to her almost immediately. She kept hard candy in her apron pocket and a store of patience that seemed bottomless, and within a month of her arrival, it was not uncommon to see 2 or 3 of the town's younger children trailing after her on the days she walked to the mercantile, peppering her with questions about the place she'd come from, which she answered with the same careful thoughtfulness she brought to everything. "Is it cold there too?" asked little Sarah Hendricks one gray afternoon, walking alongside Aniela with her mittened hand tucked uninvited into the older woman's free one. Very cold, Aniela said. Colder than here in some ways, but there is also the sea, which is something this place does not have. The sea is very big, bigger than anything you have seen, I think. Bigger than the mountains? Different than the mountains. The mountains stay still. The sea never stays still. It is always moving, always making noise, like it has too much to say and not enough time to say it. Sarah considered this with the great seriousness of a child working through a new idea. Do you miss it? Aniela was quiet a moment, her breath clouding in the cold air. Sometimes, she said finally, but I think a person can miss one thing and still be glad of another. This is also true. She did not elaborate, and Sarah, satisfied with the answer in the way children often are with answers adults find incomplete, skipped ahead toward the mercantile window to look at the ribbons displayed there. And Aniela walked on behind her, and if there was something heavy in her chest in that moment, something that ached with the particular loneliness of a person far from everything she'd once known, she did not let it show on her face. Not everyone in Frost Crossing came around so easily. Mrs. Hartley at the mercantile maintained a cool, appraising distance that never quite warmed, no matter how much business Aniela's growing household needs brought through her door. The young man at the livery, Cole Anders, Gareth learned his name was, had a habit of making comments just loud enough to be heard and just vague enough to deny if challenged, comments about appetite and appearance dressed up as jokes, the kind of cruelty that hides behind the defense of, I was only teasing. Gareth heard about most of these incidents secondhand through Ezra's habitual gossip or through his own observations on his rounds through town, and each time something in him hardened a little further, though he remained, outwardly, as quiet and undemonstrative as he had always been. He was not a man given to confrontation for its own sake. But there came an evening, deep into that first hard month of winter, when the matter came directly to his door. It was Cole Anders himself who brought it, stumbling into the saloon loud with drink and louder with opinions. In earshot of half the town, including, as ill luck would have it, Gareth himself, who had stopped in to settle a minor dispute over an unpaid tab. Sheriff ought to know better, Anders was saying to no one in particular, swaying slightly against the bar. Bringing some fat foreign woman out here to be his housekeeper. Man's got eyes. Could have picked someone decent looking, someone who'd actually be of use instead of just sitting around eating his stores bare. Whole town's laughing about it. You ask me. Nobody asked you, Gareth said, and his voice, though quiet, cut through the saloon's noise the way cold cuts through a thin coat. The room went still. Anders turned, blinking at him with the slow recalibration of a drunk man realizing too late who he's been talking to. Sheriff, I didn't mean nothing by it, just... You meant exactly what you said, Gareth said, walking closer, his voice level but with an edge beneath it that made several men along the bar set down their glasses. Miss Kovac has done more honest work in this town in 1 month than you've managed in the year I've known you. She doesn't owe you, or anyone in this saloon, an explanation for the shape of her body, and the next man I hear running his mouth about it is going to find himself spending a night in my jail thinking over his manners. We clear? Anders, sobered considerably by the directness of it, mumbled something approximating agreement, and Gareth held his gaze a moment longer to make sure the message had landed, then turned and walked out into the cold without another word, leaving the saloon considerably quieter behind him than he'd found it. He didn't tell Aniela about the incident. He saw no reason to add to whatever weight she was already carrying. But word of it traveled, the way word always travels in a small town, and by the end of the week, Aniela had heard a version of it secondhand from Mrs. Calloway, who'd had it from her nephew, who'd been in the saloon that night. She didn't say anything to Gareth about it directly, not at first. But that evening, over a supper of roasted chicken and the good bread she'd finally mastered in the temperamental stove, she was quieter than usual, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You heard something, he said finally, when the silence had stretched long enough to become its own kind of conversation. I heard you defended me, she said. In the saloon. Gareth shrugged, focusing on his plate. Man was talking foolishness. Somebody needed to say so. You did not have to. No, he agreed. I didn't. She was quiet a moment longer, and when he finally looked up, he found her watching him with an expression that was harder to read than anything he'd seen on her face since the day she'd arrived. Something caught between gratitude and disbelief. The look of a person unused to being defended, turning the unfamiliar sensation over carefully, as if checking it for hidden costs. "Where I come from," she said slowly, "and even in the city here before this place, people say things about how I look, and mostly, nobody says anything back. It is easier that way, for them. Easier to let it go by than to make trouble over a fat woman's feelings." She said the word fat plainly, without flinching, the way a person names a fact they've long since stopped fighting. "I did not expect—" She stopped searching for words, and then simply said, "Thank you." "Wasn't asking for thanks," Gareth said, gruff in the way he always was when conversation strayed too close to feeling. "Was just saying what's true." "Even so," Aniela said. "Thank you." He nodded, once, and they finished the meal in a silence that had changed shape since the start of it. No longer the careful silence of two strangers, but something quieter and steadier. The silence of two people who had, without quite meaning to, begun to trust each other with something neither of them had words for yet. The winter ground on, brutal and unrelenting, the kind of season that tested every structure and every person in Frost Crossing down to the framework. There were nights the wind screamed so hard against the house that Gareth lay awake listening for the sound of the roof failing. There were mornings the well froze solid and had to be broken open with an axe before water could be drawn. There was a stretch in the dead of January when the temperature dropped so low that 2 ranch hands on the Drummond spread were found half frozen in a line shack and had to be carried to the doctor on sleds, and the whole town held its breath until word came that they'd survive, missing fingers but alive. Through all of it, the sheriff's house remained, against every expectation the town had carried about the soft, foreign, overweight woman who'd stepped off that train in autumn, one of the warmest and best-kept homes in Frost Crossing. Aniela rationed supplies with a careful, practiced hand that spoke of having survived lean years before. She kept the fires fed without waste, mended every torn garment before it could be discarded, stretched every meal further than Gareth would have thought possible, and did it all without complaint, without the bitterness that might have been forgivable given how the town had first received her. Gareth, watching all this unfold through the long, dark months, found something shifting in himself that he didn't have a name for, and wasn't in any particular hurry to name. He noticed the way the house had stopped feeling like a place he merely survived in. He noticed that he found himself, on the long, cold rides back from county business, hurrying his horse a little more than necessary, eager for the warmth of a lit window and the sound of someone moving about inside. He noticed that conversation between them, once stilted and formal, had begun to loosen into something easier. Not effusive, neither of them was built for effusiveness, but comfortable, the kind of quiet companionship that didn't require constant filling. He noticed, too, though he kept this observation more carefully guarded even from himself, that he had begun to watch Aniela's face when she thought no one was looking. The particular care she took folding linens, the small private smile that crossed her features when one of the town children said something that delighted her, the steady, unhurried way she moved through her work as though she had decided, somewhere along the way, that this house, this town, this cold and difficult place, was somewhere she intended to belong. One evening in late January, with the wind howling outside and the fire burning low and steady in the hearth, Gareth found himself sitting at the kitchen table long after the meal had been cleared, watching Aniela mend a tear in one of his shirts by lamplight, her head bent over the work, her dark hair coming loose from its pins the way it always did by evening. "You're good at that," he said, for lack of anything better, and immediately felt foolish for saying it. Aniela glanced up, amused. "It is a small thing, mending a shirt. Most things you do well. That's not a small thing where I come from." She held his gaze a moment, something careful and searching in her expression, and then looked back down at her work, though Gareth thought he saw in the lamplight the faint color rising in her cheeks. "You are kind to say so," she said quietly. "Not kind," Gareth said. "Just true." The fire popped and settled. The wind outside threw another fistful of snow against the window glass. And in the warm, lamplit kitchen of a house that had once held nothing but silence and a single chair, two people who had each spent years learning to expect very little from the world sat together in a quiet that neither of them wanted to break. While outside, the winter that had brought them together raged on, indifferent to the small, fragile thing taking root inside. It would be many weeks yet before either of them found the courage to name what was growing between them. There would be harder trials before spring. County troubles that would pull Gareth away for days at a stretch. A decision Aniela would have to make about her own future that would test everything she'd built in this unlikely place, and a choice Gareth would eventually have to make that he had spent his whole guarded life avoiding. But that night, in the lamplight, with the mending in her lap and the shirt nearly whole again under her careful hands, something had already shifted that neither the cold nor the town's judgment nor the weight of either of their pasts would be able to undo. Outside, the snow kept falling over Frost Crossing, burying the fence lines and the frozen creek and the silent, waiting mountains. And inside the sheriff's house, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, something had begun, quietly and without ceremony, to feel like home. February came in like something with a grudge. The cold that had settled over Frost Crossing in January had been hard but bearable. The kind of cold that tested men's resolve and a woman's supply management and left most things intact if you were careful. February was different. February was the kind of cold that didn't just bite, it burrowed, settling into walls and floorboards and the spaces between things, making every room and every building feel provisional, temporary, like shelter that might decide at any moment to stop cooperating. Even the horses at the livery stood with their rumps turned to the wind and their heads low. And the few men who had to be out on county business came back looking worn down in a way that had less to do with tiredness than with having been argued with, hard and long, by the weather itself. Gareth was away more than he was home that month. The county troubles that had been simmering since autumn, a long-running dispute between the Drummond family and two smaller ranching outfits over water rights that the snow had temporarily buried under more immediate concerns, had begun to resurface with new ugliness. There'd been a fence cut on the Heller property, a threatening note left on a gatepost on the crane spread, and then, on a Tuesday in the second week of February, two of Drummond's hired hands got into it with a crane cowhand outside the feed store, and the cowhand came out of it with a broken nose and a lot of anger looking for somewhere to go. Gareth spent 3 days riding between properties in the driving cold, talking to men who didn't want to be talked to, and listening to grievances that had been accumulating for years and weren't going to be resolved by any conversation he was capable of having in the back of a barn in February. He came home late on Thursday with a headache behind his eyes and his coat stiff with dried ice from where the sleet had caught him on the open road. Aniela was still up. She usually was when he came in late. He'd noticed that early on, though she never said anything about it, never offered it as evidence of concern or made any ceremony of it. She was simply there, by the fire with her mending or her reading, and the kitchen was warm, and there was something left on the stove that could be heated quickly without fuss. Roads were bad, she said, not looking up from the sock she was darning, which had a hole in the heel the size of a silver dollar. Bad doesn't cover it, Gareth said, dropping into the chair across from her and pulling off his gloves. His hands were red with cold, the knuckles cracked from the dry air. He pressed them together and stared at the fire without really seeing it. She glanced up then, taking him in with that quiet, assessing look she had. Not intrusive, but thorough, the look of a person who had learned to read how people were doing by watching for the things they didn't say. "Eat first," she said. "Then tell me about it, or don't. But eat first." He didn't argue. The food helped. It always did, more than he admitted to. And somewhere in the middle of the bowl of bean soup she'd left warming, the headache behind his eyes began to loosen its grip. "Drummond's boys are going to hurt somebody," he said, when the bowl was mostly empty. "Not going to be satisfied until they do. Man like Drummond, he doesn't understand that winning in court means something. Only thing that means something to him is making the other man back down." "And the other men?" Aniela said. "The Heller family, the Cranes?" "Scared," Gareth said, "which makes them dangerous in their own way. Scared men do stupid things when they're backed into corners." Aniela was quiet a moment, turning the darned sock in her hands, checking her work. "There is nothing more you can do tonight," she said. "Tonight it is February and it is late, and you have been out in the cold for 3 days. Whatever Drummond decides to do, he will still be deciding it in the morning." Gareth looked at her, something shifting slightly in his expression. She wasn't wrong. She had a way of doing that, cutting through the thing he was worrying at and finding the plain bottom of it, without making him feel foolish for having worried. He wasn't used to that in another person. He'd spent so many years with only his own head for company that he'd forgotten conversation could do anything but circle. "You're practical," he said, which came out a little blunter than he'd meant it. "I have had to be," Aniela said, without any heat in it. Just a fact, stated plain, the way she stated most things about herself. She set the sock down and looked at him steadily. Go to sleep, Sheriff. The county will not fall apart before morning. He went. And though he wouldn't have said so, the house being occupied when he arrived in it, the fire being maintained, the soup being warm on the stove, these things were not small. They were, in ways he was only beginning to understand, the difference between coming home and merely returning to a place he happened to live. Word of the saloon incident, Gareth's dressing down of Cole Anders back in January, had done some work on the town's behavior, though not as much as Gareth might have hoped. The open mockery had quieted somewhat, replaced by the subtler, more insidious kind, the raised eyebrows across a room, the conversations that stopped just a beat too late when Aniela walked in, the particular kind of smile that isn't a smile at all, but a judgment wearing one as a mask. Mrs. Hartley at the Mercantile had developed a habit of commenting on the quantities of things Aniela ordered in a voice pitched just loud enough for the other customers to hear. Another 5 pounds of flour, Mrs. Kovac? My, we do go through it quickly at the sheriff's, don't we? Not quite accusation, not quite insult, but not nothing either. Aniela never took the bait. This was the thing about her that Gareth came to understand gradually, over weeks and months. She had developed, through years of necessity, a kind of deliberate patience with cruelty that was not the same as weakness. She didn't engage, didn't argue, didn't allow herself to be provoked into reactions that could be used against her. She simply paid for her flour, thanked Mrs. Hartley with a courtesy that must have been infuriating precisely because it was entirely genuine, and walked back out into the cold with her supplies and did not speak of it when she got home. But she wasn't impervious. Gareth knew that. He saw it in the evenings sometimes, a heaviness that settled over her when she thought no one was watching, a particular kind of tired that had nothing to do with the work she'd done that day. He saw it in the way she occasionally stopped in the middle of whatever she was doing and stared at a fixed point on the wall with an expression too complicated to be called sad and too controlled to be called fine. He saw it once, coming in from the back porch earlier than she expected, when she was sitting at the kitchen table with a letter in her hands, one of the rare letters that came to her in foreign handwriting from somewhere far away. And her face was open in a way she never allowed it to be when she knew she was being observed, raw and young-looking and achingly tired, and she looked up at the sound of his step and immediately rebuilt the careful expression she wore in public. And he pretended he hadn't seen what he'd seen, and they both let the moment pass, and neither of them mentioned it. But he thought about it. He thought about what it cost her, this life she'd made for herself in a country that had not exactly thrown open its arms and welcomed her in, this daily performance of competence and unconcern in the face of a town that had decided what she was before she'd opened her mouth. He thought about the letter in her hands and the raw look on her face, and something about it stayed with him, the way certain things do, quietly and without permission. It was the children who changed the temperature of the town fastest, because children have no patience for the slow machinery of adult prejudice and no investment in maintaining it. By the middle of February, it had become common knowledge among Frost Crossing's younger population that Miss Aniela at the sheriff's house kept hard candy in her apron pocket and would always have time to answer a question, no matter how strange or small. She'd been recruited, in the way children recruit adults they've decided to adopt, into an informal and entirely unauthorized position as storyteller, teacher of foreign words, and authority on the ocean, which several of the children had never seen and had developed, through Aniela's descriptions, an almost reverent fascination with. She told us about fish, reported young Thomas Heller, age 7, to his mother with the gravity of a person conveying important intelligence. Fish so big they can swallow a man whole. She said she saw one once from a ship. Probably exaggerating, his mother said, though privately she found herself curious. She wasn't exaggerating, Thomas said with absolute conviction. She doesn't exaggerate. She told me that too. The children's parents, who had been more than willing to repeat Mrs. Hartley's commentary on the new housekeeper's appetite and fitness for frontier life, found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having their children sing the woman's praises at the supper table, and having to decide whether to contradict children who clearly adored her. Most of them, being practical people in the way frontier life demands, found it easier to quietly revise their opinions than to maintain a cruelty their own kids couldn't understand. Not everyone revised, but the balance shifted, slowly and unevenly, the way real things shift, not all at once, but in pieces. Some people coming around faster than others, some dug in harder than anyone had the patience to unstick. That was the truth of it. The world doesn't change cleanly, and the people in it don't either. And Aniela, who had no illusions about the speed at which prejudice retreats, did not mistake the softening of some attitudes for the softening of all of them. Still, progress was progress, even when it was messy and incomplete. Bam! The thing that happened in the third week of February was this. The Widow Calloway's roof, which had been threatening to fail under the weight of the accumulated snow, finally gave way on a Wednesday morning, collapsing the back corner of the house inward in a shower of snow and old timber that, mercifully, the old woman had not been standing under when it went. Gareth was out on county business when word reached him, and by the time he rode back in that afternoon, he found that Aniela had already been at the Calloway house for 4 hours. She hadn't been able to fix the roof. That required men and lumber and a dry day, none of which were currently available. But she'd done what she could, moved the old woman's most important possessions away from the damaged section, sealed the breach temporarily with canvas and rope that she'd borrowed without asking from the shed behind the jailhouse, banked a fire in the undamaged part of the house to keep the temperature from dropping to dangerous levels, and was currently sitting at Mrs. Calloway's kitchen table drinking tea she'd made in the woman's own pot, while the old woman talked at length about the winter. Her husband had patched a nearly identical roof failure with timber he'd cut himself in the dark 40 years past. Gareth stood in the doorway taking this in. Mrs. Calloway, who had been one of the town's more vocally skeptical voices about the new housekeeper back in the fall, was watching Aniela with an expression that could only be described as besotted. "Your woman saved my good china," Mrs. Calloway announced, upon noticing Gareth in the door. "And my husband's letters. She knew without me saying. Got them out of that room before the second section could go. She's not," Gareth started and then stopped, because the correction he'd been about to make, "She's not my woman, she works for me," felt suddenly inadequate to whatever was actually happening in this room, and he let it go. He arranged for 2 men from the livery to come the next day with lumber, and he came himself, and they patched the Calloway roof in the bitter cold, working fast and not talking much, the way working men do in weather that punishes idleness. Mrs. Calloway insisted on feeding all of them, and Aniela, who had returned that morning to help, moved between the 2 houses with a practicality and efficiency that made the work, hard as it was, feel organized. Walking back to the house that evening, tired and cold with sawdust on his coat, Gareth fell into step beside Aniela on the narrow path, the snow packed high on either side. "You didn't have to do what you did for her yesterday," he said. "I was here," Aniela said, "and she was not safe. What would you have me do? Wait for someone else to be here instead?" "Most people would have waited." "I am not most people," she said, without pride, just matter of fact. And Gareth, despite everything, felt the side of his mouth pull into the rare approximation of a smile. "No," he agreed. "You're not." She glanced at him sideways, something in her expression flickering. Not quite surprise, but close to it, the careful attention of a person registering something unexpected. Then she looked away again, back at the path ahead, and said nothing else. But she didn't shorten her stride, and they walked the rest of the way home together in a silence that had nothing uncomfortable left in it. March came, and with it the first signs that the winter, for all its ambitions, had not managed to be permanent. The snow didn't recede, it was still deep and present and entirely committed. But the light changed, the days lengthening by increments, and there was an hour some afternoons when the sun came off the snow at a certain angle and the whole world turned briefly gold and almost warm. And you could stand on the porch and feel, under the still cold air, the first suggestion of something different coming. Aniela noticed it. Gareth noticed her noticing it. He came around the side of the house one March afternoon and found her standing on the back porch with her arms wrapped around herself, not against cold, but against the feeling of standing still, the posture of a person thinking hard about something that has no clean answer. "Spring soon," he said, leaning on the porch railing beside her, not close, but close enough to make it clear he wasn't passing through. She said. He waited, the way he'd learned to wait with her, knowing that she thought before she spoke and resented being rushed. "I have money saved," she said finally, her voice careful. "Not a great deal, but enough for a ticket somewhere and a few months' room and board while I found new work." She paused. "I've been thinking about what to do with it." Gareth said nothing. He felt something tighten in his chest, a quiet alarm he chose not to look at too closely. "There's a city to the east," she continued, "larger than here. More people, more work. Perhaps more—" She stopped, searching for the word. "More tolerance. For someone who looks like me." "People in cities aren't more tolerant," Gareth said, and his voice came out flat. "They're just better at pretending." "Maybe," Aniela said. "But I have been a stranger in this country for almost a year now, and I have learned that in a small place, a strange person is very visible. There is nowhere to disappear to, here. Every mistake I make is public. Everything I am is—" She made a small, frustrated gesture with her hand. "Disgust." "You want to disappear," Gareth said. "Not an accusation, just a clarification." "I want to be seen without being stared at," she said, which was not the same thing. And they both knew it. Gareth looked out over the back field, where the snow was beginning, just barely, to draw back from the south-facing slope, a thin, dark line of bare earth visible at the base of the fence. He thought about what to say, and rejected several things, and settled finally on the truth, which was what he generally settled on when he wasn't sure what else to do. "You've done more good in this town in 4 months than most people do in 4 years, he said. "And a good portion of the people in it know that, even if they're not the type to say so out loud. The Hendricks family, the Calloway widow, every kid who's ever gotten hard candy off you and gone home knowing what an ocean sounds like." He stopped because he could feel himself getting somewhere he hadn't planned on, somewhere he wasn't yet prepared to be. "I'm not asking you to stay for any particular reason. That's your own business to decide. But I'd want you to know what you've built here is real. It's worth something. Walking away from real things on account of people who were always going to stare at you no matter where you went." He shook his head. "Seems like a waste." Aniela was very still beside him. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than usual, something unguarded in it that she didn't often allow. "You're difficult to argue with," she said. "I've been told that." "I imagine you have." She was quiet another moment, looking out at the thin line of exposed earth along the fence, the first small evidence of a season turning. "I have not decided anything," she said at last. "I am only thinking." "Then think," Gareth said. "Take your time. It's still winter." She looked at him then, and something in her gray-green eyes shifted, something complicated and careful and not quite resolved, and Gareth held her gaze a moment before looking away, because some things, he had learned, have to be approached sideways, or they startle. He went back inside. Aniela stayed on the porch a while longer, her arms still wrapped around herself, looking out at the snow-covered field and the thin, dark line of earth that ran along the fence like a sentence waiting to be finished. And the March light came off the white ground and turned, everything briefly gold around her before the sun went behind a cloud, and the afternoon went ordinary again. And after a while she went inside too. And neither of them spoke again about cities to the east, not that day, and the house held them both in its worn, warmed rooms as the winter outside measured what it had left. The thinking about cities to the east did not go away, the way Gareth had half hoped it might. He could see it in Aniela sometimes, a particular inward quality that came over her at odd moments, standing at the kitchen window watching the snow retreating from the yard, or pausing in the middle of folding laundry with her hands still and her eyes somewhere else entirely. She never brought it up again directly, and he didn't push, but it sat between them like an object placed on a table that both people have agreed, by mutual unspoken consent, not to move yet. March moved through its paces the way March in that country always did, taking back the winter inch by grudging inch, never quite delivering on the warmth it occasionally hinted at, freezing over again each night what it had loosened during the day. The mud season started, which in some ways was worse than the snow, turning every road in the county into a slow, sucking trap that delayed mail and supplies, and made every trip between properties twice the effort and half the speed. Gareth rode out 3 times in the first 2 weeks of March on county business, each time returning later and muddier and more tight-jawed than the last. The Drummond situation had not resolved. If anything, it had hardened. Hiram Drummond was a man in his 60s who had been the largest landholder in the county for 20 years and had decided, somewhere along the way, that size entitled him to conduct that smaller men didn't get away with. He wasn't loud about it. That was the thing that made him difficult to confront directly. He didn't threaten in words you could quote back to him. He suggested. He implied. He let his hired hands do the louder work, while he himself maintained a surface of aggrieved reasonableness that made every attempt to hold him accountable feel like an overreaction. The cut fence on the Heller property had been repaired. A week later, the Hellers' water access from the creek that ran through the eastern edge of Drummond's land was suddenly, inexplicably, redirected. A ditch dug on Drummond's property, perfectly legal in itself, had the precise effect of pulling the creek's flow away from the Heller boundary. Drummond's attorney in the county seat, a man named Forsyth who wore good suits and had the kind of smile that made Gareth want to wash his hand after shaking it, had the paperwork to show that the ditch predated any agreement about water rights, which was almost certainly a lie, but was a lie documented well enough to be difficult to disprove quickly. He's going to keep at this until one of those smaller outfits breaks, Gareth told Ezra, late on a Thursday evening, after returning from a day of riding the boundary lines and talking to men who were running out of patience faster than they were running out of options. And when they break, he'll buy them out at a fraction of what the land's worth, and he'll have exactly what he wanted from the start, and there won't have been a single thing I could have pinned on him legally. Can't arrest a man for being the kind of man he is, Ezra said. No, which is the main thing wrong with the law. Gareth pulled his boots off and set them by the fire. I've written to the Territorial Land Office, asking for a surveyor to come out and verify the original water rights documentation. That'll take time, but it's the only card I've got that Forsyth can't shuffle. Drummond won't like that. No, he won't. Gareth looked at the fire a moment, which is exactly why I'm going to do it. From the kitchen came the sound of Aniela setting a pot on the stove, and then the particular creak of the floorboard between the kitchen and the front room that Gareth had stopped meaning to fix because he had, without quite realizing it, started to find the sound useful, a small, domestic signal that the house was occupied, that something was happening in it beyond the solitary operations of one man's survival. It was a Tuesday in the third week of March when Gareth rode out to the Heller property and did not come back that night, or the night after. He'd sent word back with one of the Heller ranch hands, a brief note for Aniela that said only that the situation had escalated and he'd be out 2 or 3 days, that she should ask Ezra if she needed anything. Standard enough. It wasn't the first time he'd been away, and Aniela had long since proven she didn't need supervision or protection in his absence. But what had actually happened at the Heller spread was worse than the note suggested. 2 of Drummond's men had ridden through the Heller fence line in broad daylight, not cut it this time, but ridden through it on horseback, trampling 40 yards of it flat, and when young Dan Heller had come out to confront them, words had been exchanged that came within a breath of becoming something that couldn't be undone. No shots had been fired, no one had been physically injured, but Dan Heller had come back inside with his hands shaking and his jaw set in a way that his father recognized and was frightened by. And his father had sent for the sheriff because the alternative, he said, was him sending for a coffin. Gareth spent 2 days on the Heller property and a third riding between the Heller and Drummond spreads in an effort to put enough distance between the two situations that they wouldn't combust before the territorial surveyor could arrive. He did it through the steady, patient, deeply unglamorous work of talking to men who were furious and men who were frightened and men who were both at once, listening. When listening was what was needed and being hard when hardness was what was needed. Using his authority not as a bludgeon but as ballast, something to keep both sides from tipping over into the irreversible. By the time he rode back into Frost Crossing on Thursday evening, he was carrying a tiredness in his bones that was only partly physical. The county's troubles had a way of following him home, and he'd never quite figured out how to leave them at the door, though he'd spent years trying. He was almost to the house when he noticed the light was wrong. There were 3 windows lit on the ground floor instead of the usual 1 or 2, and when he got closer, he could hear voices, Aniela's and at least 2 others, though the words were lost under the wind. He pushed the door open and found the kitchen occupied by Aniela, Mrs. Calloway, and Clara Hendricks from 3 houses down, all 3 of them at the kitchen table with cups of something hot, and the table between them spread with what appeared to be a collection of damaged winter garments needing repair. All three women looked up when he came in. "Sheriff," said Mrs. Calloway, with the cheerful authority of a woman who had long since decided that the sheriff's kitchen was a perfectly reasonable place to be on a Thursday evening. "Ladies," Gareth said, taking in the scene with the expression of a man who has been surprised but is too tired to make anything of it. "Sit," Aniela said. "I'll get a bowl." He sat. Clara Hendricks, who had been standoffish with Aniela through most of January and February, was showing her a tear in a child's coat with the ease of someone who had been doing this for months, explaining its origin, something about a fence post and a moment of bad judgment by her eldest son, while Aniela examined the tear with the practical attention she brought to anything that could be fixed. Mrs. Calloway was talking about something else entirely, a story about a mending circle she'd belonged to 30 years ago, which had apparently become the center of considerable social drama that she was only too happy to revisit in detail. It was, Gareth thought, accepting the bowl Aniela set in front of him, a remarkably ordinary scene for a house that had once held nothing but a single chair and a man who'd stopped expecting company. He ate without interrupting the conversation, and nobody required him to participate in it, and the fire was good, and after a while the tiredness in his bones began, not to lift exactly, but to settle into something more manageable. The women left around 9, Mrs. Calloway patting Aniela's hand at the door and telling her she'd bring the rest of the mending Thursday next, and Clara Hendricks pausing to thank her in a quiet, genuine way that was different from her earlier coolness. Not a complete reversal, but a turning, the way tides turn, slowly and without announcement. When the door closed, Aniela came back to the kitchen and began clearing the cups, and Gareth was still at the table with the empty bowl in front of him. "How long has that been happening?" he asked. "The mending circle?" She glanced at him. 3 weeks. Mrs. Calloway asked if she could bring a friend, and then the friend asked if she could bring someone else, and a small shrug. "It grew. In my kitchen." "You said it was my kitchen to run," she said, and there was the faintest edge of amusement in it, deliberate, watching to see if he'd push back. "I did say that," he agreed, and he wasn't bothered, which they both knew, and she went back to clearing cups. But April's arrival was more honest than March's had been. The snow began to retreat in earnest, pulling back from the south slopes first, then from the flat ground around the town, leaving the mud season behind, and then the first green of new grass in low places where water pooled and warmed. The creek that ran east of town ran fast and loud with snowmelt, and the mountains, which had been white from base to peak since October, began to show their dark rock shoulders again above the tree line. Gareth noticed, with a feeling he might have called unease if he'd been in the habit of naming such things, that Aniela had grown quieter. Not unfriendly, not withdrawn exactly, but inward in a way that was different from her usual thoughtfulness, a deeper quiet, the kind that collects when a person is working something out that they haven't yet brought to words. She was saving money. He knew this because she'd mentioned it herself months ago, casually, as people mention habits, and he'd noted it and said nothing and filed it away where he filed most things he didn't know what to do with. She was a practical person, and practical people in uncertain situations saved what they could. He understood this. He did not, when he thought about it honestly, disagree with her reasons for doing it. A woman alone in a strange country, dependent on a single employer in a small town that had not entirely decided to accept her. Building a reserve against uncertainty was not just sensible, it was necessary. He knew this. He also knew, because he was not a fool, that a reserve against uncertainty becomes, at a certain point, the means of leaving. He had not let himself think too directly about what that meant until a Wednesday afternoon in early April, when he came home to find Aniela at the kitchen table with paper and pencil, working through a column of figures with the focused attention she brought to the household accounts. She closed the paper when she heard him come in, not quickly, not guiltily, but deliberately, the way a person closes something private, and he saw, in the fraction of a second before she did, enough to recognize that what she was adding up was not the household budget. He didn't say anything. He hung up his coat and his hat and washed his hands at the basin and told her about his day in the same plain way he always did, and she listened and asked the occasional question and served supper, and nothing outwardly was different. But that closed piece of paper sat on the edge of his awareness all evening, the way a stone sits in a boot, small, impossible to ignore. He lay awake that night longer than usual, staring at the ceiling while the April wind moved through the eaves with a sound softer than winter's wind, a sound that had almost something forgiving in it. And he thought about the closed piece of paper, and about the March conversation on the back porch, and about cities to the east, and about what kind of man waits until a woman has one foot out the door before he admits to himself that he doesn't want her to go. Not an admirable kind, he decided, and tried to sleep. He was away again this following week. The territorial surveyor had arrived at last, a precise and humorless man named Aldrich, who needed escorting around the relevant properties before Drummond's attorney could find a reason to obstruct the process, which meant 4 days of riding in good weather mud and bad weather rain, translating between Aldrich's technical language and the plain frustration of farmers who just wanted to water their stock from a creek that had always, in their memory, been accessible. It was necessary work. Gareth knew it was necessary work. He also knew, riding back toward Frost Crossing on the 4th afternoon with the mud drying on his horse's legs and the last of the day's light going gold over the mountains, that the thing he was most aware of being relieved about was not the progress of the surveyor's report, but the fact that he was going home. Not to a house. Home. The distinction had crept up on him so gradually that he'd missed the exact moment of its arrival. The way you miss the moment a season actually changes. You look up one day and the light is different and the air is different, and you think, without drama, when did that happen? He pushed the horse a little faster on the last stretch. The house was lit when he got there, the kitchen window warm in the early dusk, and he could smell something cooking from the yard. Something with onions and something with good bread, the particular combination that meant Aniela had been at it a while. He put the horse up himself rather than leaving it for Ezra in the morning, taking his time about it. And when he finally came through the back door, Aniela was at the stove with her back to him, stirring something, her dark hair pinned up with 2 pins and already starting to escape them in the way it always did by evening. She turned at the sound of his step and said, with the directness that was simply how she communicated, "You look like you've been dragged behind the horse rather than riding it." "Nice to see you too," Gareth said, and she almost smiled. He washed up and sat down, and she set food in front of him, and he ate. And she sat across the table with her own plate, and they talked about the surveyor and about the Heller situation and about a tree that had come down in the south yard during the rain and needed clearing. All ordinary things, all the texture of a shared life, built from ordinary things. He was almost done eating when she said without preamble, the way she said most important things, "I received a letter today from a woman I worked with at the boarding house in the city. She says there is a position available there again for someone with my experience. She thought I would want to know." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. "Is that what you want?" Gareth asked. His voice came out level, which cost him some effort. Aniela looked at her plate. "I don't know," she said. "That is the honest answer. I told myself when I came here that I would stay 1 season and see. It has been 1 season." She paused. "And another one coming." "And you've been adding up figures," Gareth said. She looked up at him quickly, something flickering across her face. "I saw the paper," he said. "I wasn't looking, but I saw it." She was quiet for a moment. "I have enough saved," she said carefully, "to go somewhere and start again without depending on someone else's goodwill to survive. That is not nothing. That is—" She stopped, and when she went on, her voice was a degree quieter, a degree more exposed. "For most of my life, I have not had that. The choice to leave a situation that was not good for me. I wanted to have it, at least once, even if I did not use it." Gareth set down his fork. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, and she looked back at him with that careful gray-green gaze that never quite let you see all the way in. And he thought about all the things he'd been not quite saying for 6 months, and about the kind of man who waits too long. And he thought, not tonight. Not like this, at the end of a 4-day ride, with mud on his boots and food still on the table, and nothing arranged the way it ought to be for a conversation this important. He thought all of that, and then he opened his mouth and said none of it, because the truth was that arrangements didn't matter as much as he'd always told himself they did, and he was tired, and she was sitting across the table from him with her hands around her teacup and her hair falling out of its pins, and outside the April wind was doing the thing it did now that it had lost its winter meanness, moving easy through the new leaves, and something in him decided, without consulting the rest of him, that enough waiting was enough. "Aniela," he said. He looked at him. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and for a moment just held her gaze because the words were harder to find than he'd expected now that he'd decided to look for them. Not because they weren't there, because they mattered, and things that matter tend to resist being put into sentences. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I want you to hear it to the end before you argue with me. Can you do that?" She studied him for a moment, wary and attentive, and then nodded. "You came here because I needed someone to keep this house," he said. "And you've done that. Nobody could say you haven't. But somewhere between October and now, the thing I'd want you here for stopped being the house. The house is—" He gestured vaguely at the room around them, frustrated by the inadequacy of the word. "The house is fine. The house is better than it's been since my father lived here. That's not the point anymore." What? He stopped, running a hand through his hair in the way he did when he was irritated with himself. "What I'm trying to say, badly, is that I don't want you to stay on because I'm paying you to. I want you to stay because—" He stopped again. Aniela was very still. Her hands were still around the teacup, but her knuckles had gone a shade whiter. "Because this is where you belong," he said finally, which wasn't perfect, wasn't poetic, but was the plainest version of the truth he had, and he'd always done better with plain. "Not this house specifically, not this job. With me. Here. Whatever that means going forward." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking you to stay as my housekeeper, Aniela. That's not what I'm asking." The kitchen was very quiet. She stared at him across the table with an expression he couldn't read at all, which was unusual, and her eyes had gone bright in a way that might have been the lamplight and might have been something else. And she didn't say anything for a long moment. And Gareth, who had said more in the last 2 minutes than he typically said in a week, sat back and let the silence be, because he'd said what he'd said, and there was nothing to be done about it now except wait and see what she did with it. Outside, the April wind moved through the new leaves, light and directionless, carrying nothing but the smell of spring and the sound of the creek running hard with snowmelt 2 streets over, and the lamp on the kitchen table held its small, steady light between them, while Aniela looked at him with eyes that had gone careful and inward and complicated, the way eyes go when a person is confronted with something they have wanted and been afraid to want in equal measure, and doesn't yet know which feeling is going to win. Part Bon Louis. Viết 3.000 đến 3.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phủ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hồi thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình, Việt như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sàng, có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa, lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Chi đan bắt buộc không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. She didn't answer him that night. What she did instead was sit with her hands around the cooling teacup for a long moment, looking at him with that complicated expression he couldn't decode, and then she said very quietly, "I need to think," and stood up and cleared the rest of the table, and that was all. She didn't dismiss what he'd said. She didn't argue with it. She carried the dishes to the basin with the careful, deliberate movements of someone keeping themselves occupied on purpose, and Gareth, who understood the difference between a rejection and a person buying time, let her have the space without pushing into it. He went to bed. He did not sleep easily. In the morning, she made breakfast the same as always. Eggs, bread, coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in, and she asked him about the day's county business with the same direct interest she always showed, and he answered, and they move through the morning with the ordinary mechanics of people who live in the same house and have learned each other's habits. But there was a quality to the air between them that hadn't been there before, a kind of careful alertness on both sides, the way the air feels before a storm that hasn't decided yet whether it's going to break. He didn't press. He was not, by nature or by practice, a man who pushed. He'd said what he'd said plainly and without embellishment, and she'd heard him, and whatever she decided would be her own decision, made in her own time, and he would live with it. This was what he told himself, sitting at the jailhouse desk that morning, staring at a land dispute document he'd read 3 times without absorbing a word. Ezra came in around 10 with 2 cups of coffee and the look of a man who has noticed something but is pretending otherwise. He lasted about 4 minutes before the pretending collapsed. "You seem off," he said, which was Ezra's version of delicate inquiry. "I'm fine," Gareth said. "You've read that same page 4 times. The print's small. Ezra sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around his cup and said nothing for a moment, which was Ezra's version of waiting. Then, "Anything to do with your housekeeper?" Gareth looked up. "I'm not prying," Ezra said quickly, with the expression of a man absolutely prying. "It's just, you came back from those 4 days out looking like a man who'd made up his mind about something, and this morning you came in here looking like a man who's waiting to find out if his mind was a mistake." Gareth put the document down. "You're observant," he said, in a tone that did not mean this as a compliment. "Small town," Ezra said unapologetically. "Not much else to do." He paused. "She's a good woman, Gareth. I know half the town took its time figuring that out. But she is." "I know she is," Gareth said. "That's not the question." "Then what is?" Gareth picked up the document again. "Whether she knows it about herself," he said, and left it there. And Ezra, for once, let it lie. Aniela thought for 3 days. Gareth knew this because he could see the thinking on her. In the extra care she put into tasks that didn't require extra care, the way she scrubbed the kitchen floor on a Tuesday when it didn't need scrubbing, the way she reorganized the pantry shelf that was already organized. He'd come to understand over months of living in the same house that she cleaned and sorted when she was working something out, that her hands needed to be doing something concrete while her mind moved through difficult country. He left her to it. On the second day, she was sharp with young Thomas Heller, who had come by in the afternoon with the dogged persistence of a child attached to a person, and said something careless about the mended coat she'd fixed for him. Not unkind, just the thoughtless commentary of a 7-year-old. And Aniela snapped at him, brief and uncharacteristic, and then immediately caught herself and apologized with a thoroughness that was at least partly guilt about the sharpness. Thomas forgave her in the instant, the way children forgive people they love, and went home none the worse for it, but Aniela stood in the doorway after he left with a look on her face that Gareth recognized from the inside. The specific discomfort of having been less than you wanted to be, in a moment where it mattered. On the 3rd evening, she found him. He was on the back porch after supper, standing in the dusk with a cup of coffee, looking out over the yard where the new grass had come in thick and green against the retreating edge of mud. The mountains to the north still held snow on their upper reaches, white against the deep blue of the evening sky. It was a good evening, quiet and cool, and the tension of the last 3 days had worn on him enough that he was glad of the quiet. He heard the door behind him, and then she was standing beside him, close enough that their arms were nearly touching, looking out at the same yard. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, without looking at him, "I have been thinking about what you said." "I know," he said. "I have been thinking about it since before you said it, actually," she said, which surprised him enough that he turned to look at her. She was still looking at the mountains. "I have been trying not to think about it for several months because thinking about it was dangerous, but I have not been successful at not thinking about it. That is the truth." Gareth set the coffee cup on the porch railing and waited. "When I was a girl," she said slowly, "in the place I came from, I was always too much, too large, too loud, too much appetite for everything. My mother used to say it with love, I think, but there were others who did not say it with love. By the time I was old enough to understand what people thought of women who took up too much space, I had already learned to be ashamed of the space I took up." She paused. "I carried that shame a long way, across an ocean, into this country, into this town." Another pause, and her voice was careful now, picking its way. I have had men say kind things to me before. In the city. A few times. But they were kind in the way you are kind to someone you feel sorry for, or kind because they wanted something from me that I found out about later. Kindness used as currency. She finally looked at him, and her gray-green eyes were steady and direct. I do not think that is what you are doing. I do not think you are capable of that kind of calculation, actually. You are too blunt for it. I'll take that as a compliment, Gareth said. It is one, she said, without any humor in it, which was somehow more serious than if she'd smiled. But knowing that you mean what you say is not the same as knowing how to believe it, and that is where I have been stuck. She looked back at the mountains, believing that someone could want me, not what I do, not my cooking and my mending and my management of the household accounts, but me, plainly, as a person, as a woman. Her voice dropped a register. I have been trying to believe that for 3 days, and I have not entirely gotten there yet. I want you to know that because I think you deserve an honest answer. Gareth was quiet for a moment, thinking about what she'd said and what she hadn't said, feeling his way through it. He'd spent enough years alone to understand the difference between a wound and a weakness, and what she was describing was not a weakness. I'm not asking you to believe anything all at once, he said. I'm not in a hurry. She looked at him again. What I said the other night, he continued, choosing his words with more care than he usually bothered with. I meant it, every part of it. But I'm not asking you to take it on faith in one swallow. That's not... He stopped, frustrated with himself briefly. I know what it costs to trust something after you've been let down enough times. I'm not going to stand here and tell you it'll be different and expect you to feel certain about it immediately. All I'm asking is that you don't leave. Not yet. Give it the time it needs. Let it be what it is. He held her gaze. Can you do that? Aniela looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her working through it, the careful internal accounting of a woman who had learned to be precise about risk. Yes, she said finally. Quiet, certain, unadorned. I can do that. He nodded. She nodded back. They stood together on the back porch in the cooling evening and looked at the mountains and didn't say anything else for a while. And it was enough. The week that followed had a different quality to it than any of the weeks before. Not dramatic, not changed in its outward texture, but different in the way a room is different when you've moved one thing and suddenly the light falls somewhere it didn't fall before. They were careful with each other in a way that was new, attentive in small, unannounced ways, Gareth stopping to fill the woodbox without being asked, Aniela leaving his coffee on the desk at the jailhouse without mentioning it when she'd come to town for errands, both of them circling a new understanding that had no established form yet and required a certain delicacy to keep from going wrong. There were awkward moments. A morning when they both reached for the same pot on the kitchen shelf, and their hands brushed, and both of them pulled back, and the conversation after had the stilted quality of two people trying too hard to seem unaffected. An evening when a silence that had always been comfortable between them suddenly felt weighted, and neither of them quite knew how to navigate back to the version of it that didn't require work. These things were normal, Gareth told himself. The machinery of two people becoming something new to each other made noise and ground sometimes before it ran smooth. He'd never been graceful at this kind of thing. He knew that about himself. But there were other moments too. A night when Aniela laughed, a real laugh, the full one he'd only heard a handful of times, startled out of her by something Ezra had said at supper when Gareth had invited him over on an impulse both of them had been surprised by. And the sound of it filled the kitchen in a way that made something in Gareth's chest contract and release like a fist opening. A morning when she was in the garden, turned away from him, examining the first shoots coming up in the kitchen plot she'd started from seed, indoors and transplanted as soon as the ground softened, and he stood in the doorway watching her run her fingers along the edge of a leaf with the same care she brought to mending, the same focused pleasure she brought to anything she'd made with her own hands, and he thought, with a plainness that surprised him, I'm going to spend a long time watching this woman, and that is exactly what I want. He didn't say it aloud. Some things didn't need saying to be true. It was Mrs. Calloway who said it publicly first, which was perhaps inevitable. The old woman had no patience for pretense and had never in her long life seen the point of keeping observations to herself when speaking them was so much more satisfying. She said it at the Thursday Mending Circle, which had by now migrated from an occasional gathering to a firmly established weekly event that occupied Gareth's kitchen with the women of Frost Crossing, regardless of his own schedule, and had developed over the course of its existence a social weight that he'd have needed to be considerably ruder than he was to disrupt. He came in from a day's work to find 5 women at his kitchen table. Mrs. Calloway, Clara Hendricks, a woman named Ruth Alderman, who ran the town's one schoolroom, and 2 others he knew by sight but not well, and he said his hellos and went to wash up, and was halfway up the stairs when he heard Mrs. Calloway's voice carrying clearly through the ceiling. "It's obvious as the nose on your face, Clara. Man's been walking around in a fog of usefulness ever since he stopped being able to hide that he's in love with the woman." He stopped on the stair. A brief silence below. Then Clara's voice, lower, more careful. "You think she—" "Oh, she's been done for months," Mrs. Calloway said, with a satisfaction that suggested she'd been waiting for this conversation for some time. "You watch her face when he comes in a room. She just doesn't know what to do about it yet. You know how she is, careful about everything." "Can't blame her for that," Ruth Alderman's voice said. "Town wasn't exactly gentle with her when she arrived." "No, we weren't, and that's a thing we ought to sit with a while." This was Mrs. Calloway again, and the satisfaction had shifted into something more serious. "I wasn't gentle either, not at first. Thought she'd be useless out here. Thought that because she looked—" A pause, and when she went on, there was the slight stiffness of a woman revising herself. "I was wrong, and I know I was wrong, and I'd be grateful if the younger women in this room who are still carrying opinions they got from listening to me or Agnes Hartley would take the time to revise them the way I have, because Aniela Kovac is twice the woman most of this town deserves. And if she ends up staying here, which I intend to do my part to encourage, this county will be better for it." He stood on the stair for another moment, very still, and then he went quietly the rest of the way up, and he sat on the edge of the bed in the room he'd slept in alone for 6 years, and he stared at the quilt Aniela had mended and aired and returned to him last October like something resurrected from disuse, and he sat with what he'd heard for a long time before he went back down. Agnes Hartley, predictably, was not among those who revised. She had been a minor irritant throughout the winter, her commentary carrying just enough deniability to make confrontation feel like overreaction. But in the warming weeks of April, with the town's attitude visibly shifting and the mending circle growing, and the stories of Aniela's goodwill spreading in the particular organic way that genuine acts of kindness spread in small places, not announced, simply known, Hartley had begun to feel the ground moving beneath her and had responded by digging her feet in harder. It came to a head on a Friday morning at the Mercantile, and Gareth wasn't there for it, which was perhaps the most important thing about it. He heard of it, like most things, through Ezra, and then through a more complete account from Ruth Alderman, who had been present. Aniela had come in for supplies. Standard enough, a thing she'd done every week since October, and by now the Mercantile visits had lost their early tension for most of the regular customers who'd gotten used to her, who greeted her by name, who had stopped staring. But Hartley had chosen that particular Friday to finally drop the deniability entirely. She'd said it in front of 6 customers. She'd said that a woman Aniela's size had no business pretending to be suitable company for the county's sheriff. She'd said it with the particular viciousness of a person who has been holding something in for a long time and has decided she has nothing left to lose in releasing it. She said it using words that Ruth Alderman, in recounting it, declined to repeat. What Aniela had done was this. She had set her list on the counter, looked at Hartley for a moment with an expression that Ruth described as very calm and very complete, and said, in a voice that did not shake, "My size has nothing to do with my worth. I have known that for a long time, even when the people around me did not. You are welcome to your opinion, Mrs. Hartley. I'm not going to argue about my own value with someone who has not yet discovered it." Then she had picked up her list and waited for her order to be filled, and said nothing else, and left when it was done. Ruth Alderman told Gareth this on Friday afternoon with the directness of a woman who teaches children for a living and has no patience for leaving important information unstated. "She handled herself with more grace than I would have," Ruth said, "but I want you to know it happened because I think she won't tell you herself. She was right. Aniela didn't mention it that evening. Gareth, who had spent the afternoon thinking carefully about how to address what needed addressing, went to the mercantile himself the following morning. He didn't make a speech. He was not a speech-making man, and the situation didn't need one. He walked in, waited while Hartley finished with another customer, and then, when they were as close to alone as the mercantile got, he said, plainly and without raising his voice, that what she'd said to his housekeeper the day before was the last such thing she would be saying, and that if it happened again, he would take steps to ensure that the mercantile license the county renewed each year was reviewed with considerably more scrutiny than it had been receiving, which was not a threat he made lightly or intended to use without cause, but which was not empty either. Hartley's face went several colors. "I have been patient," Gareth said, still quiet, "because some people need time to come around, and that's human, and I understand it. But patience has a length, and you've used yours up. We're clear." He bought a tin of coffee, thanked her with a courtesy that must have been infuriating, and left. He didn't tell Aniela about this either, not because he was hiding it, but because it wasn't the kind of thing he needed credit for. He'd done it because it was right, and because he'd waited longer than he should have, and that was the end of it. But he came home that afternoon and she was in the kitchen, and she looked at him when he came in with the same careful, reading look she always used to take his measure, and whatever she saw in his face made something shift in hers. Something quiet and decided, like a door settling closed on a room that had been drafty for years. "You went to see Hartley," she said. Not a question. He set the tin of coffee on the shelf. "Ran an errand in town." "Gareth?" He turned. She was looking at him with the full force of that gray-green gaze, and it had none of the wariness in it that it had carried for most of the winter, that constant background appraisal of a person checking whether trust was still being warranted. It was open, steady, and it cost her something to hold it there. He could see that, the way you can see when something costs a person even when they don't flinch. "Thank you," she said. "You already thanked me once this winter for something I didn't need thanking for," he said. "I know. I'm thanking you again." She held his gaze. "Not for what you said to her, for—" She paused, and he watched her look for the words, and when she found them, they were plain and careful and exactly right, "for deciding that I was worth the trouble." He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and took her face in both his hands, which were rough-knuckled and scarred from years of work, and not the hands of a man who knew how to do this gracefully, and he knew that, but he did it anyway, and she let him. And for a moment they were simply 2 imperfect people standing in a warm kitchen on an April evening, looking at each other without any of the careful distance they'd been maintaining for months. And the thing that had been growing between them since October was there in the room fully now, undeniable and unhidden, and neither of them looked away from it. He kissed her. Briefly, without ceremony, without elegance, the way a man does something he should have done long before and is too aware of the delay to make a production of the act itself. She kissed him back, and it was real and clumsy and a little awkward in the way of 2 people who haven't quite worked out how to exist in this new version of themselves yet. When they pulled back, they were close enough that he could see the brightness in her eyes. Not tears exactly, but close. The tension between relief and disbelief that comes when something you wanted and were afraid to want is finally just real. "Still thinking about cities to the east?" he asked. She let out a small breath that was almost a laugh, unsteady and genuine. "Not at this particular moment," she said. "Good," he said, and dropped his hands from her face and stepped back, not far, just far enough to breathe, and the kitchen settled around them with its familiar sounds and smells. The fire in the stove and the smell of the coffee tin he'd set on the shelf and the early evening light coming through the window above the basin where it always came. Outside, April was finishing what March had started, pushing the last of winter back into the mountains, and the town of Frost Crossing was moving through its ordinary Friday evening business, mostly unaware that anything had changed inside the sheriff's house. Most of the town, that is, Mrs. Calloway, who had a view of the sheriff's back porch from her own kitchen window, and had, in her long life, developed considerable skill at reading the quality of other people's evenings from a distance, poured herself a second cup of tea and smiled at nothing in particular, and said to the cat on the windowsill that she'd known it would come around eventually, and that some things just needed winter to complete them. And that was all. Spring came to Frost Crossing the way it always did in that part of the country. Not all at once, not with any particular grace, but in fits and starts, one warm day followed by 3 cold ones, the mountains giving back their snow slowly and reluctantly, the creek running loud and brown with melt before it finally cleared. By the middle of May, the mud had dried to firm earth, and the grass had come in green across the flat ground around the town, and the trees along the creek bank were putting out leaves, and the air had lost its winter edge and become something a person could stand in without bracing. Gareth noticed all of this more than he usually noticed the seasons changing. He'd spent enough winters in frost crossing that the cycle had become a kind of background noise, something that happened around him while he focused on the work of each day. But that spring he noticed the light changing, the way the evenings stretched out longer, the way the yard behind the house looked different with Aniela's kitchen garden coming in. Actual rows of things growing where there had only ever been bare ground before. And he found himself paying attention to details he'd stopped seeing years ago. The way you start seeing a place again when someone else is looking at it alongside you. Things between them were not simple, and he would not have said they were. Nothing real ever is. There was still a carefulness in Aniela that ran deep, a habit of self-protection so ingrained it operated almost independently of her conscious choices. Moments when she pulled back from something warm between them, the way a person pulls back from a fire they've been burned by before. Not because the fire had done anything wrong, just because the body remembers. Gareth had his own version of this. 6 years of solitude leaves marks on a person, teaches the muscles of the self to work alone, and unlearning that is not a quick or painless process. There were evenings when he came home, and the presence of another person in his space felt, briefly, too loud, too much. And he had to remind himself that this was what he'd wanted, that the alternative was the silence he'd been living in, and that some adjustments require more than goodwill to complete themselves. They navigated it. Imperfectly, honestly, the way 2 people navigate a new country they've both agreed to try to learn the language of, making mistakes, and correcting them and moving forward. The Drummond situation resolved in May, in the particular unsatisfying way that legal matters often resolve, not with a clean victory, but with the weight of documentation finally growing too heavy for one side to keep pushing against. The territorial surveyor's report came back confirming what the Heller family had maintained all along. The water rights agreement predated Drummond's ditch by 14 years, and the paperwork Forsyth had produced to dispute this was, as Gareth had suspected and now had confirmed in writing, fraudulent. Not sloppily fraudulent. It had been done by someone who knew what they were doing, but fraudulent nonetheless, traceable to a clerk in the county seat's land office who had, it emerged, been receiving payments from Drummond's operation for the better part of 3 years. Gareth made 3 arrests in 1 week. The clerk, one of Drummond's hired hands who had been the one to physically cut the Heller fence, and Cole Anders, who had been running errands of a more criminal nature for Drummond than anyone had fully understood, including delivering the threatening note to the Crane property. Hiram Drummond himself was not arrested. The connection between him and the fraudulent documents was clear enough to destroy his legal position, but not quite clean enough to put him in front of a judge on criminal charges. And Gareth had enough experience with the law's limits to know when to accept what he could get, rather than overreach for what he couldn't prove. What he could get was this. The water rights were restored, the fraudulent paperwork was voided, Drummond's attorney Forsyth withdrew from the county under circumstances that suggested he found continued proximity to his client professionally inadvisable, and Hiram Drummond, stripped of his legal cover and facing the particular social consequence of a county that now knew exactly what he'd been doing, found that his position as the largest landholder in the territory bought him considerably less deference than it had the previous fall. He was not a broken man. Men like Drummond don't break easily, and Gareth had no illusions about that. But he was checked, constrained, returned to the boundaries that the law set, and for a county sheriff, that was what success looked like. Dan Heller came to the jailhouse the morning after the arrests and shook Gareth's hand with both of his, which was not something the young man did easily, being built on the same taciturn model as most of the men in the county. He didn't say much. He said, "My father asked me to tell you, whatever you need, the Heller spread is there." Gareth nodded and said he'd keep it in mind, and they shook hands once more, and that was all, and it was enough. He came home that evening carrying a lighter version of himself than he'd been carrying for months, and Aniela looked at him when he walked in the door and said, "It's done then." "Mostly," he said. "Enough." She put a plate of food in front of him without being asked and sat across the table and said, "Tell me." So he told her. The surveyor's findings, the arrests, the way Drummond's attorney had quietly packed up and left, the handshake with Dan Heller. He told it plainly, without embellishment, the way he told her most things, and she listened with the full attention she gave everything that mattered to him, asking the occasional precise question, and when he was done, she was quiet a moment. "You did that the right way," she said. "Through the law, not around it. That matters." "Matters more to some than others," he said. "Drummond thinks I won on a technicality." Drummond thinks that because he has never done anything the right way himself and cannot understand why anyone would bother. She picked up her fork. The Heller family knows. The Crane family knows. The county knows. That is the part that will last. Gareth looked at her across the table. She said these things with such uncomplicated certainty. Not naive, not sentimental, but rooted in a conviction about what was true that had survived a great deal of effort to uproot it. He had come to rely on that certainty more than he'd expected to. It was, he had decided, one of the things about her that was most entirely herself. "You're not bad to have around," he said, which was the closest he typically got to a declaration. She gave him the full smile, the real one, not the careful half-smile she'd come in with last October, but the one that had been coming more freely since April. "I'm aware of this," she said, and he laughed, which was also something that had been coming more freely. And they finished the meal in the kind of comfort that doesn't require work to sustain. It was Ruth Alderman who first said something to Aniela directly about what the town had become. Ruth came by on a Thursday morning in late May, not for the mending circle but on her own, and she sat at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of coffee and looked at Aniela with the direct measuring gaze of a woman who respects the person she's about to be honest with. "I want to say something that I should have said months ago," Ruth said. "And I want to say it plain, because I think you deserve plain." Aniela set down the bread she'd been slicing. "All right. When you arrived, I did not go out of my way to be unkind to you, but I didn't go out of my way to be kind either. I watched what was happening and told myself it wasn't my business. And I taught school for 15 years, which means I have told children 50 times that standing by while someone is being treated badly is its own kind of participation, and I stood by anyway because it was easier, and I've been sitting with that for a while." Ruth looked at her steadily. "I'm sorry for it." Aniela was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I appreciate that, more than you might think." "You didn't need us," Ruth said. "You were going to be fine regardless, but you shouldn't have had to fight for every inch of respect in a town that should have offered it at the door." "No," Aniela agreed. "I should not have, but I have fought harder battles than Frost Crossing, and I am still here." She said it without bitterness, which was the remarkable thing, Ruth thought. Just a fact carried with the same steadiness the woman seemed to bring to everything. "And I think," Aniela paused, choosing her words, "I think this town is kinder than it knows how to show sometimes. It needed time. I needed time too." Ruth looked at her a moment longer. "You're a generous woman, Aniela." "I am a practical one," Aniela said, "but sometimes they look the same." Ruth laughed, genuine and sudden, and the conversation found easier ground after that, and she stayed for an hour. And when she left, something had been settled between them that would hold up for years. The wedding, when it happened, was not elaborate. Gareth had asked Aniela in June, in the kitchen, early on a weekday morning before the day had properly started, with coffee in both their hands and his hair not yet combed and the kind of total absence of staging that suited them both. He hadn't rehearsed it. He'd woken up knowing he was going to do it that day, and had decided, as he came downstairs, that any attempt to make it ceremonial would turn it into something that felt less like him and less like them, and more like a performance of what a proposal was supposed to look like. He said, "I want to marry you. I've wanted to for a while. I'm asking now because I don't see the point in waiting any longer." Aniela had looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup with an expression that held about 6 different things at once. Then she said, "You might have combed your hair first." "I might have," he agreed. "Is that a yes or a no?" "It is a yes," she said. "And an observation about your hair. They were married in July, in the small building that served as Frost Crossing's courthouse, with Ezra Webb as witness and Mrs. Calloway in the front row. uninvited and entirely unapologetic about it, wearing her best hat and making no secret of the fact that she was crying from the moment she sat down. Ruth Alderman came, and the Hendricks family, and Dan Heller, and a dozen others who had found their way, over the course of one long winter and the spring that followed it, from strangers to something closer. It was not smooth. The judge got one of Aniela's names wrong twice and didn't apologize for it. Gareth forgot the line he was supposed to say and had to be prompted by Ezra, which he would hear about for the better part of the following year. Aniela's hands shook slightly during the ring, which surprised her because she had kept herself so steady for so long through so many difficult things. And this plain, undramatic ceremony in a courthouse in a small frontier town was what finally got to her shaking, because it was real, and because real things do that. After, Mrs. Calloway hosted a meal at her house that she had been planning for 2 months without telling anyone, producing food from a kitchen that should not have been able to hold it, and the afternoon ran on longer than anyone had planned, the way good afternoons do, and Gareth sat at the end of the table and watched Aniela move through the room, talking to Ruth, crouching down to listen to something Thomas Heller was telling her with great urgency, accepting an awkward and clearly effortful compliment from Clara Hendricks' husband, who had never quite managed to talk to her directly before. And something in him was very quiet and very still, the stillness of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was trying to reach. He thought about the fall, about the advertisement he'd written 3 times before getting it right, about the single letter that had come back with those careful, practiced words, "I understand if you prefer otherwise." He thought about the train platform, and the silence, and her face bracing for what she'd already learned to expect. He thought about how much of a person's life can be spent being seen by people who are not actually looking, and how that teaches you to carry yourself smaller, quieter, less, until you've been carrying it so long you've forgotten what your full size feels like. He thought that some people spend their whole lives being told in 100 different ways that who they are is too much or not enough, and that the remarkable thing, the genuinely remarkable thing, which he'd had to live with for nearly a year to fully understand, was that Aniela had survived all of that and come out the other side still capable of trust, still capable of softness, still capable of walking into a cold house and a hostile town and making both of them something better than she'd found them. Not because she was impervious, not because she hadn't been hurt by it, but because somewhere underneath the armor she'd built, the person who was worth protecting had stayed intact, waiting for conditions that were finally safe enough to show herself. That was the thing about Aniela Kovac. That had always been the thing about her, from the moment she'd stepped off a train onto a platform full of people who'd already made up their minds about her. She had not become what they'd tried to make her. She had remained, stubbornly and quietly and without drama, exactly herself. Agnes Hartley left Frost Crossing in August, selling the mercantile to a young couple from the Eastern Territories who came in with 2 small children and a willingness to learn. And within 3 months, the mercantile had a different quality to it. Not entirely transformed, businesses don't transform overnight any more than people do, but less weighted with the old resentments Hartley had maintained like a second inventory. Aniela went in for supplies the first week of September and was greeted by name and with genuine warmth, and she came home and set the flower down on the kitchen shelf and stood for a moment with her hand resting on it, just standing there, not doing anything, just feeling the particular texture of an ordinary errand that had not been ordinary for a long time. Gareth watched this from the kitchen doorway and said nothing, because it didn't need words, and Aniela eventually turned around and saw him and shrugged with the small sideways movement she made when she was trying not to make too much of something. "It's different," she said. "Yeah," he said. "It is." The county continued in the way counties do. Imperfect, sometimes petty, occasionally magnificent, full of people making their best and worst efforts and landing somewhere in between. Hiram Drummond did not leave. He stayed on his land and reduced his ambitions by necessity and became a smaller, quieter problem, which was not a perfect outcome, but was a livable one. The Heller family rebuilt their east fence line with lumber from the Drummond property, part of the settlement the court had required, and Dan Heller told Gareth, with a dry humor that had been largely absent from him before the previous winter, that watching Drummond's men carry the timber over and set the posts themselves had been one of the more satisfying things he'd witnessed in recent memory. The mending circle continued through the fall and into the following winter, growing to 10 women on a good Thursday, occupying Gareth's kitchen with the cheerful disregard for his schedule that had become its defining characteristic. He had stopped minding it, which surprised him. He had started, in fact, to find the sound of it, the voices and the laughter and the particular noise of a room full of women doing useful work together, a sound he associated with the house being what he'd always, underneath everything, wanted it to be, and had not known how to make it. Little Thomas Heller asked Aniela that fall, with the directness that was his greatest quality, whether she was going to stay in Frost Crossing forever, and Aniela, who had been asked this question a version of 100 times in her life, in tones ranging from skepticism to hostility, found it disarming coming from a child who simply wanted to know because he wanted her to stay and saw no reason not to say so. "I think so," she told him. "You think so or you know so?" Thomas pressed, because he was 7 and had no use for qualifying language. Aniela crouched down to his level, which she did when she was saying something she wanted him to hear fully. "I know so," she said. Thomas nodded, satisfied, and went back to whatever he'd been doing, and Aniela stood up and looked out over the yard. Over the kitchen garden she'd put in that spring now harvested and cleared and ready for the following year. Over the mountains turning their autumn colors in the distance, and she felt the truth of what she'd just said settle into her bones the way warmth settles into a cold room. Gradually, completely, without any single moment you can point to as the one where the temperature changed. She had crossed an ocean to find a country that did not quite know what to do with her. She had come to a town that had taken one look at her and decided it already knew what she was. She had worked in cold rooms and slept in borrowed beds and eaten alone more evenings than she could count, and she had carried, through all of it, the particular loneliness of a person who cannot find, in any of the faces around her, a reflection of what she knows herself to be worth. And then she had stepped off a train onto a platform in a place she'd never heard of, and the man who was supposed to be waiting for a housekeeper had taken off his hat and called her by her name, and reached for her suitcase before she could protect herself from the gesture, and it had taken her until April to understand that she had been, from that first moment, in the presence of someone who was going to make her prove nothing. That was what she had not known to look for. That was what she had not known to name as a thing she needed. Not rescue. She had never needed rescuing, and would have rejected it if it had been offered in those terms. Not charity, not protection, not the tolerance of someone who decided to overlook her flaws. What she had needed, and what she had found in a quiet, difficult, imperfect man in a cold house at the edge of a frontier winter, was simply someone who looked at her and saw, from the start, before she'd earned it, before she'd proven anything, a person entirely worth looking at. You don't know what that costs you to go without until you have it. You don't understand how much of your energy has been going into the daily maintenance of a dignity that no one around you is willing to confirm, until the day someone confirms it without being asked, and you feel the release of it like a muscle unknotting after years of tension. Aniela had spent most of her life being told, in the language of stares and whispers and the practiced cruelty of people who dressed their meanness as concern, that her body made her less, that her size was an argument against her worth. She had fought back against this her entire life, not always loudly, not always successfully, but she had fought because somewhere in her there had been a stubbornness that refused completely to accept the verdict. The frontier had tried to confirm what all the other places had told her. It had looked at her from a train platform and found her wanting. It had weighed her in the scales it used for women and decided, on sight, that she was too much and not enough simultaneously, which is the specific cruelty reserved for women whose bodies don't fit the narrow template of what the world has decided it wants to look at. And she had simply continued to be herself, which was the only answer she had ever had for it, and the only answer that had ever, in the end, made a lasting difference. There is a thing that happens in small places when a person who was once dismissed becomes, undeniably, necessary. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens the way most real changes happen, in pieces, over time, through accumulation. Someone's child mentions a story about the ocean, and the dinner table conversation changes direction. Someone's coat gets mended so well it lasts another 3 winters. An old woman's china gets carried out of a damaged room by someone who knew, without being told, that it mattered. These things do not make the news. They do not announce themselves. They work quietly. the way water works on stone, and the stone changes without quite knowing when it stopped being what it was. By the time the second winter came to Frost Crossing, Aniela Kovac was not the foreign woman who'd arrived on the Thursday train and given the platform something to stare at. She was simply herself, the woman who ran the sheriff's house, who kept the mending circle, who made bread for the Hendricks family when the father was down sick, who could be found on a cold afternoon with a child on each side listening to a story about the sea. She was not loved by everyone. She was not accepted by everyone. The world doesn't work that cleanly, and she had no illusions about it. There were still people in Frost Crossing who carried their old judgments like stones in their pockets, heavy and useless, and she passed them on the street and greeted them the same as everyone else, because carrying grudges had never been a thing she could afford. But the town's center of gravity had shifted. That was the true thing, the thing Mrs. Calloway said to anyone who would listen, with the satisfaction of a woman who had watched it happen and had done her part to push it along. The town's center of gravity had shifted, and the woman who had arrived with a single worn suitcase and been dismissed before she'd spoken a word was part of why. On the first Thursday of November, Gareth came home from a county ride to find the kitchen full as it always was on Thursdays, and he made his way through it with the ease of a man long accustomed to his house being occupied. And Aniela found him at the kitchen doorway and pressed a cup of coffee into his hand without breaking the conversation she was having, and he leaned against the doorframe and drank it, and looked at the room. The fire, the lamplight, the voices overlapping. His wife at the center of it, not performing anything, not working to belong, simply there, as naturally and completely as she had ever been anywhere in her life. And he thought about the advertisement he'd written 3 times over, and the single letter that had come back, and the woman who had stepped off a train expecting to be turned away. He thought, the best things don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly, and they take root in the ordinary days, in the cup of coffee left on the desk, in the creak of a floorboard that tells you someone is home, in the sound of a real laugh filling a room that was once full of nothing but a man's silence. They don't look like what you imagined when you were imagining. They look like this. They look like a Thursday evening in November, with winter coming again outside and the fire going inside, and the person you would choose over and over, standing in your kitchen, entirely and impossibly real. Aniela looked across the room and found his eyes, and something passed between them that had no name and didn't need one. The particular communication of 2 people who have learned each other's silences as well as their words, who have been winter and mud season and spring together, who have earned the right to look at each other without pretending anything. She turned back to her conversation. Gareth finished his coffee. Outside, the first snow of the second winter began to fall over Frost Crossing, quiet, unhurried, settling over the mountains and the flat ground and the frozen creek and the small cluster of buildings where people were doing their best with the time and the material they had. And inside the sheriff's house, the fire burned steady, and the voices of the mending circle filled the warm rooms. And nothing about the evening was perfect, and everything about it was enough.